of challenging with time because for some reasons the deadline has been moved ahead. So maybe a little recap on what we did last week, or 2 weeks ago actually. We went through the draft process for enterprise risk management, captured some feedback, and we got half of it. So the intent is to finish it today. In parallel, I've been working with Mike and John on duplicating, if you will, this process to adjust it to projects and business units. Therefore, the idea is to have a plug and play where, good morning, Kathleen.
Good morning.
Where you have basically 3 risk management processes, depending on how you want to start implementing it in your organization. If you want to start with project, you pull the project risk management process, and if you're happy with it, you deploy it. If you want to apply it at a division or department level, you do the same with the risk management process for department slash division, depending on how you call that in your organization. And if you want to implement it at an enterprise level, you do the same. So this is what's happening in the, let's say, behind the scene. So let me pull up the...
Elaine, did we decide not to do asset management?
What do you mean, Scott?
Well, so you have project and you have enterprise. Did we decide not to include asset management?
For me, risk management is what I call division slash department risk management. That's where
I was just wondering, because I think there would be a bunch of interest if we could make it apply to asset management as well. I know that's where Jody's coming from generally, or has some stuff, but it's up to the group what they want to do. Anything is going to be fine, but I'm just throwing that out there because it could apply to, the same process to, assets as well.
Yeah, for me, as I mentioned, unless the group sees it differently, but for me, asset management is a division or a department in an organization, depending how you call it in the various organizations. So the process that we would develop for a department or a division could be plug and play for assets management. That was the idea.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah.
Okay, so we should just go ahead and proceed then. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So to finish on with what we had for the enterprise risk management process. So I've sent to the group, we talked about the risk appetite, how it could look like. So I've sent that to the group. Again, that's a theoretical example to give some ideas on what it could be for a company. We talked about the process of identifying risk and opportunities, and here we basically said that this little group would be working on the different aspects. If I recall well, we suggested, but Jody was not here during the last meeting, that because you have developed, Jody, for asset management in your organization, you could kind of talk about this business case of assessing the risks and the opportunities. I believe we mentioned that Kathleen could talk about identifying the risk and how you guys, you've done it at DC Water, and that could build a business case for that. And I think we mentioned, and correct me if I'm wrong, that sorry,
Jessica.
Sorry. Yeah, Jessica would work on how it could work for devising a response to the risk and the opportunities. This is where we stopped. So in terms of enterprise, as we saw, the directors or the equivalent identify the risk, assess the risk, devise mitigation strategies. Each of them has a risk register. We have a template risk register that we worked on together. Then those top risks from the different directors are consolidated, and so only the top risks, and they are discussed with the layer above. So typically the DGMs are equivalent in your organizations, where the DGMs each in their lane review the top risk for the directors they are responsible for, in order to make sure, one, they recognize the risks, two, they add on to some other risks the DGMs could see as top risk in addition to those already identified. And the top risks from all those DGMs are consolidated into an enterprise risk report. And here we talk anything between, depending on the organization, but 5 and max 15 top risks, and are discussed, typically speaking, in what it is called a RAC. RAC stands for Risk Assurance Committee. So it could have the form of a big meeting with the CEO, the DGMs, and the directors. It could also have, depending on the organization and depending on how this plays, it could have also internal audit in the room. The purpose is really to align on the perceived top risks for the organization in that period of time, to agree also on the top mitigation strategies developed or being developed to address those risks. And of course, once this risk assurance committee meeting occurs, it's to seek inputs that will support the finalization of the top enterprise risk report for the period. So for the quarter, for the year, depending on the periodicity that you guys would decide. So now I'm going to...
Elaine, one thing that you also did, I think last meeting, was say that if you go way over to the left in terms of the roles and responsibilities that go down on the far left, is that you're developing an overall model here that the group can use, but it could be tailored to the individual organization and may depend on the, the subgroup or the, what your the risks that you're assessing.
Yeah. Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. And this is, and maybe I've not been clear in what I was kind of trying to say, but from indeed, Scott, from what we discussed during last meeting, this tailored portion is what I'm working with John and Michael on, kind of adapting this enterprise risk management process to a project again, or to a department. And when I say department, division, it can be to a small group, because the risk management process in a nutshell, well, it's not even in a nutshell, the risk management process is identical. Whatever level you are looking at it, it's identical, meaning that you identify your risk, you assess your risk, you respond to your risk by finding some mitigation strategies or any sort of response according to the 4Ts. You monitor those risks and the effectiveness and the progress on implementing those mitigation strategies, and you report them. So those 4 steps of the risk management cycle are really applicable at whatever level of the organization you want to implement them to. And yeah. any questions, comments, feedback, ideas on what we've just talked about?
So Jody and Kathleen and Jessica, does that make sense that it's basically here's the generic and that it's or for enterprise risk, and then it's adaptable, you know, to those other contexts?
Yep.
Yeah, I think it's more than just changing the names, though, on the left side. I think some organizations have maybe slightly different governance structures or other governance structures in place, but I think in general, the flow of this can be adapted. And so, I like the high level flow, and as long as these steps are managed in an organization, to what level, that can be adjusted.
Yeah, and and also we have a follow-up meeting with Michael and John later this week in order to adapt this model in the lane of what you're saying, Jody, to projects and department. And once we have drafted that, we bring back those two other documents to this little group, and maybe, of course, you would want to further tailor that to maybe asset management or within mind asset management, and add some steps or some other shape of governance in those workflows. That makes sense, Jody?
Yeah. I mean, it gets complicated then. I mean, if I'm talking, like, I created a asset management governance within Great Lakes Water Authority, and while I think it follows this similar process, I'm not going to detail anything that would go against this process. But I mean, it depends on what level we want to get to, right? Like how detailed we want to get with this project. So I'm not going to detail out our governance structure because that's kind of laid out. You're laying out kind of what levels you feel throughout an organization that need to address various components here. I did go through and I did go through the video from last time, and I saw the task related to kind of asset assessment. And what I realize is don't miss any meetings or you'll get assigned tasks. But but I have I have some things, and I want to kind of get maybe the group's feedback on two separate areas. So in Great Lakes Water Authority, I played a dual role when I first got here, the capital improvement planning director role, where we were looking at what I'm going to call project risk, but is not really project risk. It was a means to prioritize projects, because when I first got here, it was 20 people sitting in a room, whoever had the loudest voice got their projects, constructed. And I developed a prioritization process for projects. It doesn't look at project schedule, project funding. Some part of it is project funding. I can go over that document to see if that is an artifact that can be used for projects. While it doesn't quite align, it gives somebody some means to prioritize various projects that would ultimately get put into a capital improvement plan. That's one piece. The asset assessment process and asset risk assessment process, we're currently developing that right now. We're going through our water and wastewater AMPs. So it's not very well defined, but I have a lot of good information that I could talk to about that. And I guess I'm wondering, from the asset assessment process, what does that look like? Is it just a bunch of different artifacts that shows, our risk matrix? It shows how we go about identifying risks on each and every asset. Is it Is it one document? Is it a series of documents? How do you want to see the output from that? Kind of getting the.
Yeah, no, I think that's actually, Jody, I think that's excellent. That's really what we are looking when we talk about case study. What you are developing for asset management in your organization, it's really a case study. So we don't need all the details, but just how do you do that in general? Just exactly as you've explained it, not asset by asset, but basically you have your matrix, you put up a group together maybe, and you identify the top risk with the subject matter expert. You rank the risk based upon your matrix. You are devising and discussing some mitigation strategies, and somebody, maybe you, maybe somebody else, is monitoring and coordinating the implementation of those mitigation strategies. And then you sit down again and review if those mitigation strategies have contributed to reduce your risk profile, and maybe you report those top risks to your boss. That's exactly what it is, Jody.
So you're just talking about putting context to it and not specific excerpts from, various tables and the detail portion of it.
Yeah.
Kathleen has her hand up.
Yeah, I was just going to say, just to
Scott.
Yeah, I was just
Sorry,
going to.
Scott, Kathleen had her hand up.
Oh, go ahead, Kathleen.
Was saying
Yeah, no, I was just going to say that one thing that's been pretty unique about this group, this team, is that you're developing an overall business process that is pretty comprehensive and can be adapted to those other situations. We have artifacts, which I think you're describing, where you can furnish, here's what we're doing on this and that. And it could be in a document, a spreadsheet, a PowerPoint, that kind of thing. But we're also, the ultimate goal for improvement initiatives is also to identify improvement or do case studies where, at least at a high level, Jody, you're showing the process, you're documenting the process. So it's a question of kind of workload and interest and that kind of thing, between now and the end of March. But, if you were able to say, take, asset assessment, and planning, and take that portion of it, that applies to that with your governance structure, say on the left over there, and you were able to work with Mike Barnett to, document that would be a good case study. In addition to the group team case study. So that's for improvement initiatives. That's what we're kind of shooting for. You also talked about, by the way, asset management, plans or prioritization. And the prioritization is actually part of the scope for a different improvement initiative on CIP development and execution. So, and you weren't planning to do anything more on that. You were just giving that as background, but that's part of what exists in terms of documentation that actually Kathleen is involved in, with her team for CIP development and execution. So I don't know if you're in a position, Jody, to basically say, well, here's what we're doing. And Mike Barnett, get with me and let me help you. Mike helps you document that, so that's just another that could be a case study, a Great Lakes Water Authority application of this overall process that the team is designing. Does that make sense?
No, I understand what you're saying. We're still developing the process.
Yeah.
So
you're not ready. Is what
I mean, I think we have a good process to, identify risks and assets, identify, risk mitigation strategies, include them in the development of our AMP, but we're not to the point where we're continuously reviewing those yet. We're still developing that process. I think it would be easier to say, okay, if you're talking about risk assessment for assets, here's one way to do it. And I can provide, not change the flow chart, but just provide a overall identification of how GLWA is doing that. And I can provide excerpts from some of our Excel files. I'll put it into a PowerPoint presentation actually, because I think I can walk through it easier. And then you can attach it to that box. And then if you have one that is enterprise assessment, here's one way somebody did it. So you don't have two flow charts. You just have one flow chart with different ways that people have done it. Might be good. You know, just to get into the asset management governance that's a big animal as well.
Yeah, Mike, you had your hand up, or Kathleen, you were next. Yeah.
So I think it goes back to the first question that you asked, Scott, about can this apply to anything? We're just talking about that one box that says assess risks. Is that right? As far as what you were looking for from Jody, the one box in your workflow?
Yeah, during last meeting, we discussed about having a business case, if possible, for each of those boxes, meaning identify the risk. And I believe, Kathleen, you kind of volunteered to do this piece. Jody was not here, but having in mind that Jody had developed for his organization the matrix, which is around the assessment. So the idea was to kind of use what Jody has for asset management in his organization as a business case. And I believe we talked about Jessica developing the response part, how in her organization do they start like really addressing those risks, mitigating those risks? Do they conceive them as small little project with sub-teams? And this is what we do at WSSC Water. Or is it a more kind of general thing, or is it not mature yet? But basically having those three business case from you guys supporting those three boxes, that was a bit the idea.
So yeah, I put something together for the identification if you guys want to go through that.
Sure. Thank you, Kathleen. Sure.
Scott, your hand's up. Did you?
No, I'm putting it down because Mike had his up, but I think that what most teams are doing is not doing a generic, and they're doing individual case studies to say on this particular topic. It's not necessarily the whole process, Jody. It could be one box, but here's how we're doing that one aspect. It could be assessment, or and not get into mitigation and the rest, prioritization, but and that's what they're doing. So we're just trying to determine, what do we do with this team? Do we do a combination, or do we just do the one, group effort, which is kind of where we've been, and then provide artifacts rather than work process or what have you. So I don't know if Cello or Mike want to, jump in.
Yeah, I was just going to say that it sounds like we've got, to avoid this turning into a 25-page case study, it might make sense to have, one that talks about the generic model and the forms of it that like Alen has done, and then other case studies that refer to parts of it and then flesh that out. I think that's what everyone has described here. That might make more sense, just to avoid it turning into a huge case study. I think when people go to the repository and want to see reference, they want to very quickly read a case study and then get into the model. So we can dice it up that way, if that's okay with everybody.
Yeah, that was the idea, Mike. That was exactly what was in my mind. Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay.
I just wanted to quickly address, Jody is completely right that governance is a a big deal and a big issue. And it's also something because the departments in different places are organized differently. So it would be very difficult to come up with something that's generic. They don't even have the same names for the groups and so forth. But we're really not in a position to be prescriptive. But I think a descriptive version of it that you described, which is this is how we do it, would be very informative for others. And then they can make a mental mapping from, you know, the layout that you have to something that would be applicable to them. And eventually one day maybe we can have a prescribed thing, but it's sort of like, you know, you can say the first step would be just to lay out something that is specific, but would have a generic applicability with some modifications. So does that help at all?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, sure. Kathleen, you want to share with us what in this train of thought,
Sure.
because that's good.
See, I can find
Good
my
morning, Chris.
screens. There we go. Okay, can everybody see that? Everybody hear me?
Yeah, great,
Okay.
Kathleen. Yeah.
So this is just, I'll just run through this quickly as we talked about last time about risk identification, how DC Water does it. And I'm going to talk about the risk description, risk identification, and then examples from our authority. Okay, this is oops, don't do that. This is compliments of YouTube and CNN. Tell me if this video does not work, and I'll try and do my best Donald Rumsfeld voice. You guys hear that?
Sound. There you go. Can't hear the sound.
We
But-
cannot hear the sound, Kathleen.
You cannot. Okay. All right, this is what he says, and you guys probably have seen this before. There are known knowns. There are things that we know. We also know that there are known unknowns. That is to say, we know there are some things that we do not know, but there are also unknown unknowns. The ones we don't know, we don't know. So I don't know if you guys remember when he said this, it was repeated a lot because the language is very like tongue twister. Does anybody remember this?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And this is really what we're talking about with risk is the known unknowns. We are not going to worry about, now this won't work, the known knowns, right? Those are issues. That's a whole nother management thing that you deal with. And then the unknown unknowns are just, you know, I know sometimes we talk about the black swans and the really kind of out there things, but for the most part, we're talking about we know there is something, we just don't know what it is, like that iceberg picture that was in the first slide. So what do we know that we don't know? And this kind of goes towards risk description. There's cause and effect, and even with the different standards, some focus on effect and some focus on events or cause. But I'm not going to read through all of these. You guys can read it, but it's really where is there uncertainty? What can happen that we really don't know? And then what effect can it have that's going to impact our mission? So the risk description, we have this on our risk registers, this little, as a result of definitive cause, risk may occur, which may lead to the effect. People have a little bit of a hard time defining it that way, and I'll get into risk identification and how we manage the difficulty people have with this concept between cause and effect. But when we get to ranking it and all of that, the likelihood relates to the cause and the consequence relates to the effect. So you do have to separate them out to really figure out what your risk is, because the risk is the likelihood and the consequence. So this is an example, and this is all of our any work that we're doing in pipelines has this risk. As a result of inaccurate or unavailable record drawings, utility conflicts may occur, which may lead to construction change orders for cost and time. So, and then in some projects, you may have like a gas line or some other impact of a utility conflict that you might hit something and have a bigger problem. So it'll have a bigger effect. But this is a very typical thing where the risk is really the change orders, and the utility conflicts is what causes that. So any questions so far on just risk description?
That's exactly it, Kathleen. Exactly it.
So now we go to how do you get from risk identification to risk description? Typical responses, people, this is what they'll tell you, right? These are our risks, but there's not much you can really do to manage them until you kind of get it into a description. So what, and Elaine, maybe this is your job. A lot of times on projects, it's certainly project manager. In the asset management world, there's certainly somebody who can really clean up the information that you get into a risk description so you can do something with it. But I just kind of wanted to make that point that the risk identification, there's usually a step to kind of translate this into a risk description.
Yeah, if I may, Kathleen.
Sure.
Maybe you remember when we were in Portland in a group, we talked about the bow tie approach, where you have all the causes that are laid down, the risk description. So what is the risk exactly in the form that you've mentioned? This and this and this may trigger that risk, which will have that effect. And on the right-hand side, you have the effect or consequences or impact, as you want to call them. And basically, the more precise we are about describing the causes and the consequences, the easier it will be after that to design some mitigation strategies, because mitigation strategies are about controlling the causes whenever we can, and or reducing the impact, the effect, or the consequences whenever we can. So just wanted to kind of put it out there.
Yes. So again, this is probably information you guys already know. And I forgot about the bow tie. I think that is a good way to show it. So the risk identification step, and I'll go into the DC Water examples next, but I kind of see two ways that this happens. The asking people, what do you see? What do you worry about? What opportunities do you see? I mean, we have certain people in our organization who are kind of like the Apple, Tesla people who are just thinking about things that nobody else really thinks are even real. It's always good to get feedback from them. And then the data side is really also very intense. Asset management is clearly data driven, and vulnerability assessment, and there's a lot of risk identification that comes through a lot of work and investigation. So those are kind of the two pieces of where the risk identification comes from. So here are the DC Water examples, and this kind of goes to what we're trying to do here, where you can apply it to anything. It's really different on the identification, how we do it in these three buckets. So maybe we can talk a little bit about how we want to make this generic, or if we do. So for enterprise risk, internal audit is one thing. The auditors do, I think, an annual risk assessment, and they just do interviews. They do a survey, they do interviews, they look at previous audits, they look at strategic initiatives for our opportunities, and then they come up with these themes. And they really don't get into a risk description where they go into mitigation, because they're really looking for things that the internal audit team can have any effect on. So there's a lot of risks they just say, okay, that happens somewhere else in the authority. But the main reason this is on enterprise level is because it comes from the board of directors. They have the most input on this one. The next one is Office of Emergency Management, and that is a authority-wide and even, collaboration with regional and national agencies. Unfortunately, all the things that happened in January in DC were a really big, a lot of attention from all levels of the authority was paid on what we could do about that. And this is all top secret. So, exactly what happens and what they know about, that's not really shared. That's all very held close to the chest for obvious reasons. So operational risk, that's the risk of asset failure is the most obvious one, where you do the desktop analysis, you go through all your assets. What is the consequence? You go through the likelihood, you do condition assessment. I didn't go through more and more slides, but it's the same thing with safety, right? The safety department goes through and they have a very robust way to look at where are all the risks, where are all the opportunities to make everybody safer. Obviously, they start with issues, right? If there's some kind of claims or accidents or, COVID, but they're always looking at, the pandemic. There were all the plans before we even got into that actual situation. So that's operational, a little bit more data driven. And then, this is showing kind of why it's important on the operational side, because we've got 69,000 segments that we are looking at which ones are going to fail, which ones are more likely to fail, or which ones are a higher consequence of failing, to identify where we invest. So then on the projects, and this is really capital projects, and a lot of these, say for pipeline projects, which we do, half a dozen a year, pipeline construction projects. And so the risk registers look the same, only a lot look the same. But we put, to get to this risk description, what we did is we put 3 different columns. So they have to kind of think through what is the event, what is the cause, what is the effect. And then, as Elaine said, when you get into the mitigation part on the other side of the spreadsheet, you can really see how can you reduce the effect and how can you mitigate the cause. And we have, and one of the things, my boss is really interested in standardizing. So all of our risk tools look the same. Everybody uses the same thing. This is on project risk, not on other kind of risk. But right now, the project managers have a lot of flexibilities. Our design build projects, which their whole approach to risk is really assigning it to the right person. So whether it goes to the contractor, design builder, the financing people, or the construction people, or the owner, that's really more what their risk approach is about. And so they have different tools, and their contracts are in the hundreds of millions of dollars. So they do Monte Carlo and all those kinds of things. For most of our design bid build projects, it's just these spreadsheets, and the project managers have a lot of leeway to do it how they want. So some of them just do the risk description as one column, and they have to be able to word it properly. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't work. So that's really all I have for risk identification, and kind of like to follow up with you guys on. For artifacts, we can certainly upload the spreadsheets, the risk registers. We can do I can do kind of a 1-page narrative of what I just said. Is that what we're looking for, or is there something else?
Oh, that's good, Kathleen. That's really good in terms of identification. That's a very good example on how it could happen in practice at an enterprise level. It could happen at the tactical level with the business units, and in the project level. So no, that's really good. Thank you very much, Kathleen. That's
sure.
As far as I'm concerned, that's really what I had in mind of how it could be applied in practice at different level in an organization. And you've raised a very good point. It's a challenge to kind of design a common tool to have everybody use that tool. That's one challenge. I mean, at WSSC Water, we were lucky there was nothing, so we just went into that and do it. But when there's an history behind it, it becomes more of a challenge. No, I mean,
well, so the other tools we're getting Unifier is an Oracle product for contract management. And I believe they have like risk management modules that you can get on. So I don't know what other people have experiences with, you know, off the shelf tools. Is that, would anybody recommend for or against that?
Well, for the experience I've had with off the shelf risk management tool, they've not been very successful in the companies I've been to. Why? Because there's too many clicks and basically everybody focuses on the tool and not on managing the risks. So what has happened in the previous company I used to work for, the company spent millions of dollars on those tools. And at the end of the day, bottom line, nobody was using them. So after a few years, they were decommissioned. So this is some thought to be given to. Personally, in the 21st century, in the United States, I'm against Excel spreadsheets flying around. So what we did, and again, that's only one way of doing it. There's plenty of other way of doing it. In terms of tool, I know Crystal Ball, I know BeWise, if you want to look at them. But again, those tools are really cumbersome. What we want is an organization to have a risk culture and an organization to do risk management, not kind of saying, oh, it's here, it's there, and spending hours debating on what to do with the tool. So what we did with WSSC Water, and again, that's only one way of saying it, of doing it. I'm not saying it's the way, but one way. I have worked with my IT colleagues to develop a very simple tool that does the job. Which is basically reproducing electronically, digitally, a risk register where people enter the cause, description of the risk, the consequences, the mitigation, the risk matrix, who is the owner, the treatment measure, meaning the mitigation strategies, and the progress on the same, period. And we have a dashboard. You remember, Kathleen, maybe I don't know.
Right. Yep.
Yeah. So for that very reason, I didn't want to spend a lot of time searching for tools in the market beyond those I've experienced, which were not, and I wanted to save money. So, and my colleagues in IT developed this tool in like 3 months. So, I mean, very easy. And again, in my mind, it's really keep it simple. If you want people to adhere to it, if you want people to do it, it has to be simple. They don't have to see it as a cumbersome exercise to be doing, because otherwise you will face resistance to do it. So, yeah, But otherwise, Crystal Ball or BeWise risk module from the GRC platform are two of the famous off-the-shelf tools.
I'm wondering if Jody, Jessica, Chris might have any kind of comments or feedback or ways that your organization is doing the same thing as Kathleen, or how you might vary it. That was really good, Kathleen, but sure. Others may have some feedback.
Yeah, I'm happy to share kind of how the tools that we're using, and kind of keeping in mind that I'm more on the asset-based focus here. And I can actually share my screen and just kind of show you a glimpse of what we're doing. But we're really we're using Power BI for the vertical asset analysis side of things. And y'all just tell me if I'm showing more than you want to look at. But basically, we're kind of, I think we have, it sounds like we're operating similar to what Jody was talking about, and doing an assessment of all of the assets in our system and pulling that information together, and also kind of that prioritization on the project level side. I think it sounds like we're kind of in similar boats here. But we've kind of set it up where we go out and assess every facility in our system. And we have dashboards in Power BI that really compile all of that information together. So we are looking at the risk of every asset within the facility, looking at the useful life. You know, I'm just kind of clicking through here, but we've got the likelihood of failure identified for each piece of equipment in a facility. We have the criticality and the performance identified in general. So I like the risk matrix because we can pull together one facility, or we can look at every facility that we have and then go directly to those top risks and kind of see what needs to be evaluated. So we're using Power BI for the vertical facility side of things. And we're on the linear infrastructure. We are kind of a work in progress here, but we've started putting together some simple dashboards just using Esri GIS, where we can look at our oldest pipes and compare that to main breaks to kind of visually see what we think our biggest risk is in terms of our water main. That's something that we're working on this next year to try to find better ways of doing that, particularly on the wastewater side, and incorporating things like CCTV data that we haven't incorporated into these models yet. So ours is very, I would say, kind of basic, but we're using pretty accessible tools because our whole organization has access to Esri. We all have, we're a Microsoft company, so we all have access to Power BI, and it made sense, and it allowed us to kind of gradually improve on that process as we continue to link more and more systems together to use that better. I don't know if that helps or not. We've been really happy with the BI. We've been doing this. We started it less than a year ago, and we've gotten a lot up and running since then. So we're still a work in progress there.
This is Charlotte. This looks really nice. I'm just wondering, you're using the Power BI to sort of on the analytical layer. Is the data mostly in spreadsheets, or is it in a database, or how is on the data layer? How is it addressed?
It's a database.
Okay.
So yeah, the Power BI, everything is built on Azure. And the data that goes in is, we use SAP as our system, and we use a Trimble Unity solution to collect data in the field. So the data comes in from the assessments through Unity, which then gets pushed back to SAP, and then SAP feeds Power BI directly and gets updated nightly. So that's how that data gets in. And then the overall calculations are put together in Power BI, but the data really sits back in SAP.
Oh, that's excellent. So the data is actually in a structured form. It's within an application in a database, and then accessed through BI, rather than having a bunch of spreadsheets that the Power BI goes to, right? That's
good. There's spreadsheets. Yeah. We do a desktop analysis of our assets before we go to SAP. So we start in a spreadsheet and just trying to determine what the consequence of failure is. Identifying any redundancies that we have in assets, things like that. And so we do a little bit of a desktop analysis, and then we load that into SAP, and then we go out and we physically assess everything using our software. But the spreadsheet part is very minimal, and then it goes away and it gets pushed into SAP.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Thank you for that answer.
Yep.
It's very similar to how we're doing it in Great Lakes. How we're doing it is part of our water and wastewater AMPS. We're pulling asset information out of we use Oracle WAM as our CMMS system. We pull that out into Excel. We are evaluating from a tabletop perspective, really at the process level, to determine a high level risk. And then within each process area, we evaluate each and every asset underneath it from a tabletop perspective. We also look at, mean time between failure, some work order history on that to determine a likelihood score. We go through our process using our matrix to determine the consequence of failure for those assets. to get a total risk score. Then we haven't done it yet. We are going to bring that back into Oracle WAM. So we have all that information at the asset level, and then we're going to do reporting from there. So we're really at the 75% mark to get there. But it's a very similar process to what Jessica described. And I think you have to have kind of I like the idea. We have a lot of basic databases that we've done, for the CIP project management. It's really a basic database that we have put together for including business case evaluation, including risks on that, and prioritization of those. But for a asset management perspective, you really need some SAP, Oracle WAM, some type of base database to pull from.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think Jody and Jessica, you're really touching on a very good point. When we are at the asset management level, or I would even say engineering level, and that's really there's some correlation. You have data. Actually, the data are supporting your risk profile, and you can feed a kind of system like that, which is what we do also at WSSC Water. Obviously, when you go to the tactic level or the enterprise level, it's not only and by far supported by data. Right. So meaning that this database, Power BI or other system approach, unfortunately, cannot be applied because there's a manual input where you consolidate the risk. So, I mean, that are not necessarily driven by data, sometimes by perception, sometimes by a bit of data, sometimes by some form of history of some companies to whom it happened in the past, etc., etc. So yeah, that's really good. That's really good and very, very effective for engineering, asset management, because that's really fact base for, again, versus your objective, and that's the key. In terms of again, enterprise risk management, it would be wonderful if all the risks were data supported in a company, and you just press a button and it gives you all this. But there's a lot. Actually, that's the job itself. There's some manual interactions and some manual input in that.
Kathleen, I'm wondering, so what Jessica and Jody were describing was a very detailed, identification and dealing of risks for basically every asset. How would you basically, how might that interface or roll up, or the highest risks find their way into enterprise-wide risk? Because that could be certain, asset risks that exist out there, that might be part of enterprise-wide, risk register as well.
Sure. So I think that really goes to the risk assessment and the risk ranking and the consequence. So in other words, what is your risk appetite, and maybe if it's injury or death, or if it's a dollar threshold, you could definitely come up with a consequence on your assets where you've got a water main that's going to break, that's going to, destroy a building, say, because it was built before the building was built, and so that becomes the process flow diagram that we've developed, right, with Elaine. It goes up those levels to the deputy GM or the GM or the board or whatever. This, because the mitigation is not that easy. If you've got a water line under a building and the building's occupied, it's not an easy way to mitigate that. You need to raise it all the way up to the highest level. So I think then you go, the way that it raises up is thresholds. But I don't think the process of identification, I think it's different for operational tactical, and I think that there's always that two kind of, I had called it ask, but kind of like judgment and data are always part of your risk identification. It's not an either or by any stretch of the imagination.
Chris, you have your hand up.
Yeah. I mean, it's very interesting to see all this leading practices around the room. So Metro Vancouver is very similar in terms of the concept and the framework that we developed to what Jody and Jessica described, and as well as Kathleen. So we are looking at the asset risk using either GIS or more of a CMMS type analysis, desktop analysis. But I think what's really important is to understand the senior management, to understand what makes up the enterprise risk. I think as one of the slides that Kathleen showed, and I believe similar slide was shown by Helene way back, that asset risk is just one of the pillars of the enterprise risks. And it's very important to recognize that there are other areas that makes up enterprise risk that we need to consider and evaluate. And for that, I think it's very important to have a common framework to, like that matrix, to assess and assign a score that can be compared to the asset risk. I mean, asset risk is one of the areas that can be driven by data heavily, as we discussed, but the others are more qualitative and more of sort of subjective inputs as well, right? So I think that's the challenge that we are facing. Like, we're relatively well established, that we didn't make it like further progress. Like, we're not definitely at a 75%, as Jody was saying. We're probably at, like, I don't know, 25% maybe. But then we have a good idea of how the asset risk will be sort of contributing into that enterprise risk, but the other risks are a bit challenging because of that qualitative nature, and more of a sort of workshop based on. But very important to have that common framework, so that when we have that workshop with senior management and whoever, like, we have a sort of common way of assessing the risk in other pillars as well.
So let me ask about that, because we're really used to kind of likelihood, consequence, and a score, but we were talking this morning about the cybersecurity, and I don't know if you guys saw that SolarWinds, hack thing. We have people doing vulnerability assessments and mitigation strategies completely outside of this type of approach. And again, mostly because it's not something that wanted to be shared or distributed widely. But I don't think they're used. I don't think we're ranking that risk compared to the water main breaking.
Yeah.
Jody.
Yeah, and that's the difficult part with taking asset risk and trying to elevate it to the level of enterprise risk, because the scale is many times very different, right? We have a matrix that we're saying consequence failure. We want to use it organization wide. When you start getting down into an asset and a pump fail, you don't get any. By using that overall matrix, there's little variability in assets. You may be at 1, 2, based upon how you've identified those thresholds. What's a 1? What's a 2? What's a 3? What's a 4? So we're doing something, and we're kind of taking our organizational-wide consequence matrix and applying that to maybe individual process areas as well. So we can see what the difference is in that process area from an asset risk. By doing so, you kind of take away from the ability to roll my highest risk assets into an enterprise risk. And so it's very challenging, but I also need to see some variability so I know which assets do I need to spend my money on from a operations and maintenance and a capital perspective as well.
Yeah. Just and I know it's 11:31. maybe just very briefly, for example, at WSSC Water, assets pushed to their limits is one of the top enterprise risk. Another top enterprise risk, and I come back to what Kathleen mentioned, is risk of a breach in our systems and et cetera, et cetera. Okay, I'm not going to go into details. But what's happening? With those two top risks, the mitigation piece becomes instrumental, meaning that we have some working groups for those where we do exactly what Jody was saying for the asset management piece. So of course we have asset management that has identified in their system the top critical risk and the risk of failure and blah, 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 blah. So what can we do proactively, if anything more, to address those risks that are a big contributor to that enterprise risk? And the same thing, Kathleen, with, for example, the cybersecurity piece. I'm working very closely with our cybersecurity director. She has a risk matrix and she knows her threats, and we devise with the incident commander, for example, and other people around the table, some cross-functional mitigations around cybersecurity we have control on. So basically, those top enterprise risks cannot, by definition, unless there's something, are not super specific to one asset. Let's say, for example, you took the example of the dam. The dam is going to fall. Yes, inherently in all our companies, a dam is almost a black swan and is an asset we are monitoring. But because it's an asset that is so critical, it's an asset that is kind of mitigated and controlled already. It's in the CIP, there's some budget around it, there's some resources, blah, 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 blah. It's more, like Kathleen said, all the known unknown, meaning that we know there are some other assets around there, maybe buried assets, maybe, you know, where basically we don't know. And those are really the kind of one we want to get to know better. And that's what we do then in the mitigation risk mitigation working groups, if it helps what I've just said.
So for me, like next steps, you know, are we going to try to standardize a case study look and feel, or is this, if we're going to do a presentation, PowerPoint, or if it's going to be a document, how do we want to bring this up and provide our little area of case study to this overall process? Do we have thoughts on that, or does it?
Yeah, well, for me, for example, what Kathleen presented this morning is a case study. So, for example, I would tie this case study to the box identification that's in our process flow. That's okay. Yeah, that's what I would do. We have some artifacts, but please, Jody, bring some more. I mean, for example, your risk matrix that you guys are using for asset management, you can really bring it in. I mean, basically, I think the more, without being too much, but the more perspective we bring to the utilities that they can kind of pull as they want, the better for them. So if you bring your risk matrix and your case study for asset management for your utility, we could tie this to the process that I'm kind of adjusting with Mike and John for the department, and that department would be asset management in this case, you know, so that works fine.
So I'll put mine together. You know, I can provide the artifacts separately, but I'm going to provide kind of snippets in a presentation so people can refer to the detailed artifact if they want to, and I'll put that presentation together for I already have it. We don't have time today. I have some of it developed. I just wanted to get an idea of what detail you're looking for, and I didn't want to get too far down a road. But for our next meeting, I can share that and see if that meets your needs.
Thank you, Jody. This is Charles. I just want to say that the guiding thought should be what would help other utilities. I'm not personally worried as much about whether the report has internal consistency, because I feel that this is really a longer term effort. So I can make stuff work for the WRF report, even if there's a diversity in how people contribute. Somebody has a PowerPoint presentation, but the guiding light should really be what would be useful to me if I was a newly, somebody else in a utility who just got put into a position that you've been in for, so many years. What would be helpful to them? So, and also something that's not as much of a burden for you to prepare, what you have sort of at hand. So those would be the guidelines that I would propose. So rather than the traditional, how to make the report consistent, I'm not as concerned about that.
Okay, great.
Okay. So should I stop recording? Okay, I'll stop recording.